I should also mention that it gets back to this issue of mind control, because no spiritual entity has the power to influence physical reality on its own. In other words, there must be an interface. And I call this interfacing, I call it a biospiritual interface, something that can interface the physical and the spiritual. And I talk about this inside my book, Deep in the Garden of Consciousness, that which allows for us as our physical self to interact with that spiritual is the biospiritual interface. And that which we perceive to be spiritual, its ability to interact with us is always done through, I call a biospiritual interface. And the most powerful biospiritual interface that we possess as a human species is the human mind. It is not biological, nor is it physical. It is somewhere in between. So the interaction in terms of the spiritual self or spiritual entities, it always comes through the manipulation of the human mind. It has more to do with the science of psychology, in terms of the science of the mind, psychology itself, that true possession occurs in the physical domain through the manipulation of the mind of the human being, not the manipulation of the physical body. Now, you can manipulate the physical body through the mind, but it's not a direct correlation. In other words, a spiritual being cannot arbitrarily materialize here in physical form because it's spiritual and then take possession of a physical body. No, it doesn't work that way. There must be an interface between the two. I should also mention too here that yes, there are an infinite array of non-human entities that exist that we would call spiritual. But none of these entities have more power than the physical being that we call human being to actually impact physical reality here on planet Earth. I should also mention none of these beings are more powerful than the spiritual aspect of the human species too. And that is what I would call a soul being. In other words, that we are comprised of two parts. What happens in terms of the human species, what has happened is that we have been led to identify exclusively as just the physical part. And then we perceive the spiritual part to be external of us. This is part of the great illusion. And so anything that is spiritual, we begin to project power onto, not realizing that we're spiritual in the first place, right? Or in the second, depending on what vantage point you want to look at. And so in this sense, as a spiritual being, I fear no external entity that we may say exists and does exist in the spiritual domain. So when people talk about Satan or Lucifer or some archangel, I don't fear any of that stuff, or shadow beings. I don't fear any of that, because spiritually I exist in that same spiritual realm where we would say that these other entities exist, and they're no more powerful than I am spiritually. So I have no fear of them physically. The difference is, however, that for me, I don't externalize power even to my own spiritual self, because I recognize that my spiritual self is part of the totality of my existence, and I don't perceive my spiritual self to be outside of my physical self. They work in tandem. So part of what I'm getting at is that see, some people may externalize power to the Illuminati or to reptilian shapeshifters or to the global bankers or to the elite or to Freemasons or whatever. And these are all perceived to be physical, or at least to some degree physical. But then there are also people who externalize power to non-human entities, Thor, or to Jesus, or to Allah, or to some God being out there. I mean, it goes on and on. Some non-human entity we externalize power. Well, what I'm saying here is that if we're going to get this species back on track to cosmic respectability, we have to recognize that as a species, we do have a spiritual component, and that spiritual component is just as powerful as any other thing that we might externalize power to, that we may perceive or that we may think exists or that may exist in the spiritual domain. So part of what I'm getting at is that we have to internalize power. And see, interestingly enough, the manipulation that we see on planet Earth is all manipulation to cause us, psychologically speaking, as human beings, to externalize power. And that's why we're traumatized with information, and we begin to become fearful. We begin to externalize power, and that's how we maintain a solid state of control. That is a true possession. But if it is designed to ultimately cause us to externalize power, what do we need to do? We need to internalize power. And part of internalizing power is recognizing that we are the spiritual being too in the first place. So spiritual beings that we may be fearful of, why should we fear them? If we're fearful, if we're spiritual ourselves, there's no need to fear them.